Good evening, everyone. My name is Owen Lee. I'm an artist, a musician, and incredibly humbled to be among such amazing speakers this evening. The message that I'm going to speak about was actually echoed a few times in a few different speeches, but it's simply, there is power in pivoting. You might have already read a bit about me through my bio, perhaps, but I would like to give you a closer look into my life for the sake of context. I've had a love for music for as long as I can remember, but I've been pursuing music professionally for the past 15 years. I was born and raised in Toronto, which is where I began my professional journey, but 8 years ago, I got married to a Scotian woman and made the decision to move here to the East Coast in 2014, which is where I've been ever since. As a musician and music professional, I did feel anxiety about leaving the big city for a smaller town and what opportunities might be available for someone like me in a smaller market, but I quickly discovered that there was still power in pivoting. There's an old proverb that says, "A gift opens the way and ushers the giver into the presence of the great." This proved to be true in my life because within months of moving to Nova Scotia, I became and still am the musical director of Emmanuel Baptist Church in Upper Hammonds Plains. Thank you. Thank you. Where I minister through music on a weekly basis. I also became the choir director of the Nova Scotia Mass Choir, a position I held until 2019. And along the way, I also became the program coordinator of a local music organization called the African Nova Scotian Music Association, which is a position I held throughout the pandemic and to this very day. I'm also a solo artist performer, as well as a touring musician for several different artists. And now that I've established the different hats that I wear, I'd also like to mention that I'm still married. My wife and I just celebrated 8 years of marriage, and together we have 5 children, 2 boys, triplet daughters. So, thank you. So, Melissa, I definitely know what the floor is lava is. Needless to say, there certainly was power in pivoting to Nova Scotia. I was very confident in the trajectory of my life and musical journey by the start of 2020. At this point, I'm working full-time as a musician and busier than ever. I'm traveling and performing across Canada and internationally. My family's healthy, my bills are paid, my children are growing. By February 2020, my entire calendar year was filled with shows, tour dates, speaking engagements, workshop opportunities throughout Canada. I was fully convinced that 2020 was going to be a pivotal year for me. And indeed it was. But not in the way that I anticipated. A month later, COVID-19 started ramping up and the world began to lock down. One by one, my gigs were getting canceled, tour dates were being postponed until further notice, until they were eventually canceled altogether. Various workshops and events that I had planned for 2020 were all canceled, and the confidence that I possessed coming into 2020 slowly transformed into fear and anxiety, as I began losing more and more revenue by the day. Being an entrepreneur doesn't typically come with sick time or vacation time or any kind of paid day off. As an entrepreneur, lack of business directly affects my ability to provide for my family. Sure, there's emergency funds and CERB, but how long will it last until I have to find other ways to feed my kids? I felt like I was tumbling from the mountaintop into the valley very fast. But then something interesting began to happen. While being locked down, I began to find provision in the midst of a global pandemic. The pandemic showed me just how important artistic contributions were to my community, because even though people were locked inside trying to avoid this virus, there was still a deep hunger for music. I began to watch the world around me pivot to virtual. People were looking to be entertained by any means necessary. In-person concerts pivoted to online concerts. In-person workshops and conferences were now being hosted via Zoom or Teams or some other virtual medium. And even though religious gatherings weren't allowed, I faithfully showed up to an empty sanctuary every Sunday throughout the pandemic. Just me, my microphone, and my keyboard, singing my heart out to a video camera, knowing that on the other end of the camera, there were hundreds of people tuning in from their respective homes week after week, looking for hope, looking for peace. When you're presented with an obstacle, you can either dwell on how difficult the obstacle is, or you can shift your focus, find a solution, and pivot. At the beginning of 2020, I was stressed and anxious over the amount of cancellations that came down all at once. But by the end of 2020, I understood that music is an essential service and that not even a global pandemic could stop the world from consuming it. There was power in shifting my mentality and deciding to pivot. Mind you, virtual concerts do not compare to live music by any stretch of the imagination. But I did what was necessary to continue feeding my family. I also forged new relationships and gained new fans around the world because of the pivot. I performed in front of virtual audiences of thousands because of the pivot. I've won awards and received accolades for work that was completed after pivoting. I stand before you today sharing my experiences as a musician during the pandemic. But if I decided to dwell in defeat and not pivot, chances are this opportunity to speak to you may not have happened. I was once told that life is not just about what happens to you, it's also about how you respond when things do happen. The pandemic was hard to navigate for all of us, but it also showed me how resilient we can be when put to the test. I wouldn't quite say that I'm thankful for COVID-19 or the pandemic, but I will say that I'm grateful for the opportunities that were birthed in the pandemic and that are being birthed now because of it. There is power in pivoting. Thank you.